Okay, so this morning I'm going to show you one or two things about wet into wet watercolour, some basic principles. The first one of which is the amount of water you have on your brush. So I'm just going to mix some ultramarine colour and maybe quite a lot of it, because I shall need a fair bit for the later part of the demo. Just want to show you one or two things. So I hope you can pick this up on the video. If I dip my brush into the water, I'll use this clean water. Let's put some blue in it now. It's very full of water and very shiny. And if I dip that into some pigment, and make a mark with it, that mark is really flooded with water, and maybe it's too much for some jobs, but we'll see. But then if you dip your brush in and you take some of that water out, then you make a mark, it's considerably less flooded with water, and as a result paler, because of course it's like a deep end of a swimming pool and a shallow end of the swimming pool. This is still flowable and movable. There's enough water for the pigment to be able to flow on it, but it isn't flooded in that way, where it may be that is a good effect, or it may be hard to handle. It depends on the context. So there's a big difference between a brush full of pigment and a brush sort of half full, and also a brush which has hardly got any pigment in, which then gives you dry brush, which is a different effect again. So what I'd like to demonstrate first is how you do a flat wash. It's something that maybe occasionally you might need for certain subjects. It's not often used, but for certain beautiful flat washes, skies or whatever, or for underpainting for a different kind of subject. So the first thing you might want to do is you can draw yourself a square, or you can just do it by hand. It doesn't really matter, just do something quickly. But a little square, a block of paper that's big enough to let the colour run down. And so with my brush full, I'm starting in the corner and I'm pulling it across, and I'm using the tip of my brush to guide the pigment. And the idea is that I keep this edge, this lower edge, moving. Because the board's on a gradient, the pigment will drop down with the water, and that edge is like a kind of reservoir. So I get more pigment and I replenish that edge as I come down. This is only a little test piece, but it's the same principle if you're doing the whole sheet of paper. So draw that wet edge down and keep that moving. And when you start to run out of paint, replenish. And if you're going across a whole sheet, you might find you're replenishing every time you move across. So this is wet on dry paper. And I'm just moving down now towards the base. So I'm just using what I have because I've got plenty of paint there. And all the while, because my board is on a slope, the paint is sliding downhill and settling down into the lower part of what I painted. So you can see it's gathering there along the bottom edge. So what I'm going to do about that is take a little bit of tissue, the kitchen roll, and I'm just wiping the excess off my brush. And now I'm going to use my brush like a sponge, and I'm just going to suck that excess back up into my brush. So hopefully that will dry flat. Now that was a wet on dry attempt at a wash. So the next one, I'm going to try doing the wet. I'm going to damp the area first. And wash my brush out first, and I'm going to just put water on here, which you probably won't be able to see because it's invisible. So I'm going to just damp this whole area. And you can tell it's really damp and really shiny because it's really wet because it's shiny. And the shine is a big indicator of how wet your surface is. Now this is on a slope, so that's all going to be running down too. So if I want it to dry flat, then obviously I want to flatten it. But for the sake of the demo, I'm going to remove some excess moisture with my tissue until that surface has gone dull again. Yeah, okay. I can see that it's still damp, but it's now dull. There's no surface water on it, or very little. So I'm going to get the same wash of colour. I'm going to now put that on this damp area. The nice thing about working on damp paper is that the colour will just flow up to the edge of the damp area. Water is a great enabler of a pigmented wash, and it's even better with wet into wet. It just flows up to the edge of the damp area, and so it's like a natural kind of way of masking colour. If you damp the area first that you want to put the pigment on. So I don't know if you can see that, but I fancy that this is going on slightly more smoothly and more easily. Anyway, we'll see. It just may give us a slightly different result. Certainly I can sense the pigment flowing down a little bit more quickly. Okay, so similar thing here. It's going to gather at the bottom. So I'm taking a little bit out of my brush and I'm taking the excess out of the bottom there. So hopefully it will dry later. Now, for the last one, I'm going to try is wetting my square and then going straight in with the water, with the wash. So let's just get it nice and moist. And the point of my brush is really great, kind of drawing up to the edge of a shape. It's quite good to try to keep your wash within a certain shape, whether it's a hand-drawn shape like these or a ruled one if you've got a more precise nature. You could do it that way. Make sure it's all covered, but I've left a bit there. It's still dry, so just if you get some shine on it, you can easily see where you've left. Now that's swimming in water, and I'm wiping the excess water off here, so that I've got the same wash as I've used before, so it's not diluted more by that water on my brush. And now look at how it's flowing down really easily. I don't even have to help it, it's just going by itself, flowing down the area, the wet area. So it's moving much more quickly. Water it kind of reduces the friction as well as moistening the air, moistening the surface, so that it acts as a slide for the water, for the wash. So here we are. Let's come all the way down to the bottom, and the same thing. It's quite useful just to use it like a vacuum cleaner, vacuum up that last bit. And we'll see how those dry. Obviously, it takes time. I'm going to let them dry naturally. I'm going to get another, I'm going to leave them at an angle. Now I've got my eye off them. They'll probably do various things that I would adjust if I was looking, but never mind. Like get a little bit more paint at the bottom. I can see they are, but not to worry. So for this one, I'm going to use my board flat, and I'm going to see if I can do the same thing or a similar thing without that gradient. So could just draw myself a couple more. I'd like to show you a graduated wash. So for that I need another colour. Maybe maybe I'll try using cadmium red. With the ultramarine. This is a hue colour, so it's a natural red. And I'm just going to replenish my ultramarine as well. So there are various ways of doing a graduated wash, and I'd like you to have a little go at these if you haven't done them before. So the first one is wet on dry. So I start the same way. Got my board angled at about 20 degrees, and the colours flowing down. And with another brush, I'm going to get my red pigment, and I'm going to take that along and let the colours mix. And I could carry on with the red, or I could go back to the blue and let that graduated colour graduate again into blue. And so on. So maybe I'll just continue this and we'll see how far that comes down into the blue. So you can see, I hope you can see the red spreading down into the blue. The blue is quite wet. I'll just finish that now. Keep it simple. And another way is to work on damp paper, as I showed you in PowerPoint, and to damp the paper first. You don't have to necessarily draw a rectangle. Just wet it, and we'll, for the sake of speed this is, otherwise I would let nature take its course and let it dry flat naturally, but just, and maybe let's start with the red and let that just bleed into the damp area. I'm going to add a little bit more pigment and have less water because there's water here already. So I'm mixing a fresh lot of blue, which is more pigment and less water. So let's see what that does. It's actually moving upwards. There's so much water. Now it's starting to move downwards. I think that's where my water ended. So, and then the last way is by having it really wet. And of course, this is the high risk sort of thing when you have a lot of moisture down already, and into that you're putting other washes and colours, which also are carried by their own moisture. Then the colour moves much more quickly. So let's start with the red again. Mix it more. So it's literally flowing down. And the blue. It flows in both directions to start with, even though it's on a gradient, it flows in both directions. When it's really wet, it will do that. When it's not so wet, it will just flow downwards. So let's put a little more red in there. So another way that you can get graduated wash is working flat and letting the brush do the work, as it were. So by wetting a little square, and taking some of that moisture off, then the same colours. Blue and red. So now my board is not angled, so it will flow. It basically will flow in all directions if it can. So if I put one colour one side and one colour the other side, and then work them together, then my brush does the mixing. But as there's some moisture there, I'm working wet and wet, the colour will try to flatten itself out all the time, and you can also move it around a little bit to flatten it. Can you see how it's flattening as I do that? So that's another way you can obtain a graduated wash. Okay, so when you've done had your play with your washes and wet and wet, as it's drying, have a look and see whether it's nearly dry or whether it's still shiny. When it's nearly dry, you can see no shine, but it's gone dull, but it's still wet. And if it's a little bit cold, that will demonstrate that it's still wet. We'll keep with the same colours to avoid too much extra confusion. I think ultramarine and the naphtha red. So if I try and just make a mark in this as it's drying, I can see, yeah, it's pretty dry at the top. That's not really moving much. Down here, it's just starting to move into that damp area here. You remember it was graduated, angled, so the lower part of this wash is still a little bit damp from having been angled. So, and it will move, it will carry on moving until everything is dry. So, I'm the same with these. Now this wash here, which is beautiful actually, it's the way it's drying and the way it's moving. There's a very beautiful combination of feathered edges. But it's still quite shiny. This one's very shiny, and this one's fairly shiny, with the red being more wet than the blue. Obviously, my brush was more loaded there. But if I say do a couple of marks through there, you can see again how the pigment's moving. I think when you're doing this kind of playing, it's quite good to do a simple action and leave it and see what happens. And here again, making a mark within that wet wash, it's very quickly softening because there's so much extra water there already. The last thing I want to do is I'm going to get a brush full of water, or I'm going to wipe the edge of it so it's half full, and I'm going to just put a brush of water in each of these places and see whether that, if and what happens. Now this one down here, which I did last of all, is still quite wet, pretty wet. So maybe we'll get some backgrounds forming. And I'll have to wait for the morning to go by. This is really wet. I'm not even wiping the water off my brush. I'm just letting it really, really kind of form a puddle. So now it all takes time. The drying takes time. So I think this will show us the difference between working wet into damp and with a bit of a more slow action on the wash, so that it comes down slowly on a dry ground, and it comes down quickly on a wet ground. And when you put a lot of water into that, everything's moving very, very rapidly to start with, and it continues moving for a longer time because there's more moisture to evaporate off.